Imagine this. You go to sleep on a Sunday night, and when you wake up, the entire world's money system has changed. That actually happened. On August 15, 1971, U.S. President Richard Nixon went on TV, cut into a popular show called Bonanza, and in a single speech quietly killed the last link between the U.S. dollar and gold. That moment is known as the Nixon Shock. And to understand inflation, the power of the U.S. dollar, and even why people are obsessed with Bitcoin and gold today, you have to understand what happened before that night at a place called Bretton Woods. Stay with me for a few minutes, and you'll never look at money the same way again. Let's start with a simple question. What gives money its value? For most of modern history, the answer was gold. Under the gold standard, governments promised that their paper money could be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold. If $1 was defined as, say, 1/35 of an ounce of gold, then $20 would buy you almost an ounce. This did two big things. First, it made international trade easier because exchange rates were stable. Second, it put a leash on governments. They couldn't just print unlimited money because they needed enough gold to back it. Sounds nice and disciplined, right? But there was a problem. The world economy was growing faster than the supply of gold. And then came the Great Depression and World War II, which shattered the old system completely. By 1944, with World War II still raging, the global economy was chaos. Currencies were collapsing, trade was broken, and nobody trusted anyone's money. So delegates from 44 countries met in a quiet resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design a brand new system for the PI. Their solution was clever. The 1 ounce of gold was fixed at 3 otheries. In other words, gold backed the dollar. The dollar backed the Sebuiwayu. To manage all this, the conference also created two big institutions you still hear about today, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. For about 25 years, this Bretton Woods system worked surprisingly well. War-torn Europe and Japan rebuilt. International trade exploded. The US dollar became the unquestioned center of the global financial system. But under the surface, pressure was building. Here's the core problem. The United States had promised the world that foreign governments could always exchange their dollars for gold at $35 an ounce. But as the 1950s and 60s went on, the US kept sending dollars overseas to fund the Cold War, the Vietnam War, foreign aid, and massive social programs at home. Dollars flowed out. Gold did not flow in fast enough. By the late 1960s, there were far more dollars held abroad than the US had gold to back them at the promised price. Foreign leaders could do the math. If everyone tried to convert their dollars into gold, the US Treasury would be drained. Some countries, most famously France under President Charles de Gaulle, started demanding physical gold instead of holding dollars. Gold began to leave the United States. Confidence in the system started to wobble. Think of it like a bank promising that all deposits are fully backed, while quietly lending out much more than it has. As long as nobody asks for their money, it works. But once people start lining up at the window, you have a run on the bank. That's exactly what began to happen to Bretton Woods. In August 1971, President Nixon gathered his top economic advisors at Camp David. They knew the US didn't have enough gold to keep the promise of $35 per ounce. If they did nothing, the country risked a full-blown financial crisis. So they made a dramatic decision. On the evening of August 15th, Nixon addressed the nation. In calm, reassuring language, he announced that the US would suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. In plain English, foreign governments could no longer trade their dollars for US gold. The gold window was closed. He combined this with a temporary freeze on wages and prices and a surcharge on imports to fight inflation and protect American industry. Most viewers that night had no idea they were watching the end of an era. But globally, this was an earthquake. The whole Bretton Woods architecture depended on that gold promise. Once it was gone, the system could not survive. After Nixon's announcement, there were a few attempts to patch things up and keep fixed exchange rates, but the trust was gone. By 1973, major currencies were floating freely against each other. The dollar was no longer as good as gold. It was now what economists call fiat money, value based not on metal, but on government decree and market confidence. This had huge consequences. On one hand, central banks now had much more flexibility. They could print money and adjust interest rates to fight recessions, stimulate growth, and respond to crises. On the other hand, the 1970s brought something ugly: high inflation, oil shocks, currency volatility, and a loss of purchasing power for ordinary people. Since then, the global financial system has grown into a complex web of credit, derivatives, and massive government and corporate debt, all built on top of currencies that are backed by trust, not by gold. So why should you care about a conference in 1944 and a TV speech from 1971? Because they explain our world today, why the US dollar is still the dominant reserve currency on Earth, why central banks can create trillions of dollars, euros, or yen with a few keystrokes, why some people fear long-term inflation and turn to gold, Bitcoin, or other assets as a hedge against paper money. Before 1971, the question was, how much gold do we have? After 1971, the question became, how much confidence do people still have in our currency? That shift from metal to trust is one of the biggest financial plot twists in human history. Next time you hear someone say, money printer go brr, or you see debates about going back to the gold standard, remember this story. Bretton Woods created a dollar-centered world tied to gold. The Nixon Shock cut that link and launched the age of fiat money. We're all living in the sequel to that decision. If you'd like a deep dive on how this affects inflation, crypto, and your savings today, let me know in the comments. Because the story of money is still being written, and you're in it.